Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Allure of the Poor, sponsored by Dracaena Wines. I am your host, Lori Budd. I am a UC Davis winemaking graduate, WSET Level 2. I am a champagne specialist, which is going to come into play today, I have a feeling. And I am owner and partial winemaker, along with my husband, of Dracaena Wines in Paso Robles. So today we are going a little bit different than our typical podcast or Allure of the Poor in the fact that we are talking about a wine book. Somebody who loves wine so much that they felt that they were going to write a book about it. And the book we are going to be talking about is Press for Champagne, and it is written by Christopher Ruhland, and he is with me today. So welcome, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Lori. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
So I was excited. You reached out to me on social media. So I was thrilled. I love champagne. I love bubbles. Bubbles just kind of make me happy. So I was pretty excited to receive the book. So thank you for sending the book. Actually, thank you for sending two books because Amazon had a little faux pas going on. So we have this book here, Press for Champagne, a guide to enjoying the world's greatest sparkling wine. So before we get into the book itself, let's just talk about you a little bit. So what got you into the wine game or the champagne game? Are you just champagne, or are you just wine lover all around?
Yeah, well, thanks, Lori, and thanks again for having me. I'm a wine lover all the way around with someone who particularly loves champagne. I'd put it that way.
Okay.
I uh, I got into wine like a lot of people in my young adulthood. I started to drink wine and I liked champagne, and who doesn't like champagne, right? So I enjoyed it, but it really wasn't until a little bit later in life that I really started getting a formal education in wine, and I took the French wine scholar course. I started taking the WSET courses, and I eventually got my diploma from the WSET. And so I really just, my wife calls me an extreme hobbyist. So I once I get into something, I get into it really deeply. But I remember when I started out in my journey of really formally learning about wine, reading about champagne and looking at just how complicated it is to make champagne, how much it goes into it, how much care goes into making champagne. As you know, it's very difficult to make a bottle of champagne because of all the rules and regulations and the things that are required. And I was just fascinated that people would go through that much effort, to make a bottle of champagne, and that what I was holding really was the product of significant love and attention. And then something else happened, which is I started to realize that champagne isn't just champagne. And that's really what the book is about in a lot of ways, because I have a lot of friends who like champagne, but champagne is difficult to understand from the drinker's perspective in some ways because people refer to it almost generically, right? They'll say, "Would you like some champagne?" And they hand you a glass of champagne, right? It's as if champagne, it's bubbly, it's light, it's highly acidic, and that's it. And I think people get the idea that there are quality differences in champagne. There are some that are more expensive than others. But I think what people don't appreciate, and what I became really fascinated with, is just the diversity in champagne. How many different kinds and styles of champagne there are, and how many winemaking techniques there are to make champagnes taste different from one another, and how different people react differently to those different champagnes. And so that's a long way of saying that I just became really fascinated, and then I just started drinking a lot of champagne and trying to understand it more.
And your wife is like, all right, you're just drinking this stuff. You need to be able to do something with drinking this stuff. So, all right, I'll write a book
Right.
about it. That just means I need to buy more champagne, right?
Right, exactly. Well, she will admit that there are times when she has been frustrated with the amount of time I've spent studying wine and then writing the book. but she will be the first to admit that she has benefited greatly from that process.
I believe that. I believe that. So before we even go further, first of all, I have seen Press for Champagne. Like there's memes about it. It's all over social media. Like versions of it or whatever. And it wasn't until I read your book that that's an actual button. Like it was an actual place that created this button. It's not just like, hey, this is a fun meme thing. So can you go a little further into where this button actually is? And, did you push the button?
Sure. Yeah. So it's the title of the book is Press for Champagne. And where I got that title was from, well, originally, and I don't know if they were the first to do this, but there's a restaurant in London called Bob Ricard that is a pretty interesting, eclectic restaurant. And they drew attention to themselves by installing these buttons at booths with the label Press for Champagne. And if you press the button, somebody brings you a glass of champagne. And there's just something joyful just about thinking about that, right? I mean, just the idea of sitting at a booth and seeing a button, there's no way you're going to resist pressing that button, right?
I mean, ding,
I
ding,
mean,
ding, 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 ding.
absolutely, absolutely. And of course, since then, other people have started to sell these or create these really crafty buttons that aren't maybe hooked up to something, but there's a bell. I have one at my home, and everybody who comes to my house loves to press this button. It rings like a doorbell, and it's just really fun. But I think the idea is that champagne is associated with joy, and you look at that button and you can't help but smile. And so the book really is about the joy of champagne. That's why I chose the title, because the book is not about just let's talk about the wine region, let's get into the history, let's get all the facts so that you could, let's say, pass a wine exam. That's important, and there are plenty of books like that that are very, very good. And I have some of those things in this book, but really this book is for the wine drinker, for the champagne drinker. And so that's why I chose the title.
And when you were talking about you ask for champagne and somebody brings you champagne or whatever, my husband gets very upset with me, and I don't do it to be mean or to do anything, but like we'll be out. I don't do it to friends' homes anymore in the homes, but we'll be out at a restaurant or someplace, and they're like, "Oh, do you want some champagne?" And the first words that come out of my mouth is it champagne or is it
Right.
sparkling? And then I get the little smack from my husband. I'm like, well, I'm not being me. I'm just asking a legitimate question. I would like to know, because my decision might be, depending on my mood, my decision might be yes or no of if it's champagne. So like, it's a big
Yeah,
deal.
absolutely. And that's a fundamental aspect of champagne that, again, we're talking about the wine drinker, the average wine drinker, or even the sophisticated wine drinker, it doesn't matter. There's something that you expect from a glass of champagne, right? And so you see this a lot on airplanes too. At least if you're lucky, you want every once in a while to be in first class, and before the plane takes off, they say, "Would you like champagne?" And then they hand you a glass of prosecco. And it's not that there's anything wrong with prosecco or cava or any of the other sparkling wines. There are plenty of sparkling wines other than champagne that I enjoy, and there are plenty of sparkling wines from California, for example, that are quite good. And so, but the issue is champagne is a protected name. It's a protected designation of a particular wine region in France. And champagne only comes from that region in Champagne, France. So yes, and it's made in a certain style too. And that's important because Prosecco, for example, which is the best-selling sparkling wine in the world, more bottles of Prosecco are sold in the world than bottles of champagne. But Prosecco is made from a different grape variety, a very fruity, aromatic variety. It's made in a different way. And so you get a very different sparkling wine, which again is fine. But if you want champagne, that's not what you're getting if you get a glass of Prosecco.
And that's all I'm doing when I'm asking that question. Because I'm expecting, let's go back to Prosecco. And now I actually really do love Prosecco, but it is a vibrant wine. It is, it's Glera, so it's a completely different wine than Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. It's a different expectation, and it's kind of like I try to equate it to people, as that when you have a box on the floor and you're expecting it to be heavy, and you go to pick it up and it's empty, right? That whoa, your brain kind of freaks out for a second, right? That's kind of what my palate does when I'm expecting it to be champagne and it's prosecco. And it goes the other way around. If I'm expecting it to
Sure.
be prosecco or cava or something, and it's champagne, that's a different, my palate does that box shock.
Sure, absolutely. And one of the things about Prosecco, for example, is that in almost all cases, Prosecco is made in a way where the wine does not sit on its lees, right? And so you don't get the brioche, baked bread, dough, toasty aromas in Prosecco that you get in Champagne. And if you want those, you're going to be missing those in Prosecco. On the other hand, just this weekend we had somebody over our house. We had actually, my wife was had a few of her friends over, and I served them drinks, which is like one thing I can do. And somebody asked for a mimosa, and we happened to have Prosecco in the refrigerator. Prosecco is much better, I think, in a mimosa than Champagne, because those bready aromas and bready toasty flavors that I really like in Champagne, they don't go as well with orange juice.
Right.
And so yeah, you're absolutely right. This is an important thing to know about Champagne. It's a fundamental. I talk about this in the book. I have a section on what Champagne is and is not. Now, unfortunately, the United States allows certain California producers who prior to 2006 were using Champagne to still call their sparkling wine Champagne. So unfortunately, there's a deception in the marketplace where you see something called Corbel Champagne or
Right.
Andre Champagne, and it's very confusing, and I think it's really unfortunate, but that's still permitted.
I was going to say, I was reading it, and I was actually reading it on the plane, and I wrote down, wow, he's got a very powerful feeling against California champagne.
Well, well, against the name, it's funny. So I do have quite a number of opinions that I express in the book, and now I have nothing against. Again, I'm from California. I have nothing against California sparkling wines. I think there are some excellent California sparkling wines, um, but what I'm against is the use of the name Champagne on any wine that is not from the Champagne region in France.
And that, I am sure the people in Champagne are like, are reeling over the fact that that was allowed, because when you go through the Champagne specialist program, it is drilled into your brain. I think it's every other sentence, right? It's not champagne if it's not from Champagne, right?
Right.
Or it's only champagne if it's in Champagne. So they must be like reeling over the fact that this is allowed, but at least it's stopped in, proprietary. You can't do it anymore.
Right. Right. You can't create a new sparkling wine in the United States and call it champagne.
Right. So my first question is, what do you feel? Okay, let's talk about Champagne as a region itself. And one of the things that makes Champagne is where it's located. And it really is at one of the really kind of the most northern limit for what actually is prime wine growing regions. So what do you think is going to happen? Put on that little psychic vibe for, psychic hat for you. What do you think is Champagne is doing to help in this this truth of climate change happening? They're already at that limit and things are changing.
Right. So it's an interesting problem. And I talk about this a little bit in the book that Champagne is a place that makes great sparkling wines for a couple different reasons. One of which is just the experience, right? The fact that they've been doing it a long time, they've been making great champagne, great sparkling wines for a very long time, and that experience and ability to do it matters, right? But a second part of it is exactly what you mentioned, which is it's a cold climate, and it's at the limit at which these grapes, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, can successfully ripen. And that's very important in sparkling wines because what you want is ripe grapes, but they ripen to about 11% potential alcohol. So because in the second fermentation, you're going to get another 1.5% of potential alcohol, right? So you can't, you're not going to, it's not going to work if you have high alcohol wine in the first place, right? The base wine. And the second thing is that the grapes ripen with very high acidity. And that's very important too, because a hallmark of a great sparkling wine um, it is its high acidity. And the hallmark of champagne is high acidity. And that's important for the style. So with climate change and with the region getting warmer, there are obvious difficulties in the long run, because if you don't have the acidity anymore and you have grapes that are too ripe, well, then you're not going to have great sparkling wine. Now, so far, it hasn't been so bad, because in a way, it might have even helped what's happened so far, because in past decades, there were times when the grapes just didn't ripen, right? It was so cold that in some years there wasn't much champagne to be made. This year, so now harvest has been moved up and on the calendar, and it's not that difficult. I don't want to say it's easy, but it's not as difficult as it was in prior years to get ripe grapes every year. And in terms of acidity, one of the things that has happened is a conversation about malolactic conversion and whether that should be blocked or enabled. And in today, there are more producers blocking malolactic because they think that they don't need it. It might have been needed because the acidity was so off the charts and harsh, right? That you might have needed it to make a palatable wine. And now, if you just will simply not permit a wine to go through malolactic conversion, then you can maintain that tart acidity. So for right now, the wines are still good. You can still get great champagne. They're making great champagne right now. The issue is future decades, what's going to happen. And that's the same thing in every wine region, right? I mean, there's a concern that we won't get great Burgundies 30 years from now, right? And then they'll have to plant some other grape there, but we'll see. But it's definitely a concern. But so far, it's been managed.
And I'm curious, so, another region that is so entrenched in tradition is Bordeaux. And, just recently, they've announced that different grape varieties have been allowed to be planted and will be able to be part of the Bordeaux blends. And that was shocking enough that this region that was so entrenched in these 5 grape varieties basically are allowing these other grapes in here. But I don't think that ability translates to champagne, because of like how you were talking about the acidity, what a sparkling wine is. It's not necessarily just the grapes that are growing. You have to be able to have the grapes that create that acidity, that and the lower alcohol, so that second fermentation can occur. So I think that they're facing a different type of dilemma or a more difficult dilemma than some of than other regions, Burgundies, or that where, we're known for these grapes, but we can kind of change this around. Champagne's a little different in that realm.
Yeah, and it's different in another way too. I mean, in theory, let's just go totally crazy and say that, one day in Burgundy they decide, well, we can't do Pinot Noir anymore because it's way too ripe, so we'll just start doing Syrah. Okay, but the issue in Champagne is that these three grape varieties, as I go into some detail in the book, they really work for a number of reasons.
Right.
One of which is that they work well together. They add different things together, so you'd have to find different grape varieties that work together in the same way. The other thing that's really important is that they're not aromatic grape varieties, right? So that you can't start planting aromatic grape varieties in Champagne. You could, right? But you wouldn't make I say you would. There's lots of people who do lots of things, and that's wonderful. But again, going back to the Prosecco issue, right? Glera being an aromatic variety, and there's no lees aging, so there's no toasty notes. Those two things really don't go together, right? The real aromatic grapes, and this is why typically in the wine world you don't see, oftentimes you don't see um, a sparkling wine made from an aromatic grape variety and lees aging. So
Right.
you'd have to, again, you'd have to make the whole thing work. I mean, somehow the whole thing works right now, and there are a lot of moving parts to it. And so, yes, it would be challenging. And there is talk in Champagne, like elsewhere, of using different grape varieties. It hasn't really gone anywhere, and it would take a long time for that to develop. So we'll see. I don't know. I have difficulty predicting what's going to happen next week. So what's going to happen 30 years from now, I
Right.
have no idea.
Very good answer. Good answer. Right. So you actually just kind of led your way into what my next question was going to be. In the book, you go rather in depth, and I loved it, of how these three grape varieties work together and why they work together and what each one does in terms of creating that finished product that is champagne. So can you elaborate a little bit about what Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, actually how they work?
Yeah, sure. And before I do that, it's important to just, I think, give the background, which is that, of course, there are plenty of champagnes, great champagnes, that are 100%
Right.
Chardonnay, 100% Pinot Noir, and 100% Pinot Meunier. So that they don't have to marry together, right? And then when you get into blends, you see this the entire range of blends. This is what really creates styles in champagne, right? Because there are champagnes that are 90% Chardonnay and 10% Pinot Noir. And then there's ones that are flipped, right? And then there's some that have a little bit of Pinot Meunier, maybe 5%, some that have 33%. So there's really no limit to what you can find in terms of the way they work together. So so to be clear, there's no one formula. You know, it's not as if um, there's a scientific formula where you have to put this much in of one and this much of other to make things work. Um, that being said, they do work together in first a technical way that's probably not that important for the champagne drinker, which is that they ripen at different times and bud at different times. And so given the fact that there's a lot of weather
Mhm.
differences and different vintages in Champagne, that can be important. There can be some years where, and in some locations where Pinot Meunier does better than Chardonnay, let's say, or Pinot Noir does better than Chardonnay. And then that's a good thing in a cold climate because then you can still make wine, right? And especially given the fact that there is reserve wine in Champagne. So just the fact that you have this difference in the way that they grow and their resistance to disease can matter, right? But in terms of the way they marry together, so you know, most people are familiar with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and the flavor profiles. And you know, Chardonnay can be, you know, very high in acidity in Champagne, very lean in a lot of ways. Um, Pinot, Pinot Noir is lower in acidity. It still has high acidity, but in Champagne it doesn't hit the same high notes. It can add this like softer, rounder texture. People say that Pinot Noir adds body to the blend. I'm not sure that I 100% agree with that description, but I get the point. So I'll just, without being too pedantic, I'll just go ahead with body. at this point. But so where you get Chardonnay and you get a really, really crisp, high acid, fairly neutral wine. With Pinot Noir, you're getting more of the the red fruit, but even stone fruit and that sort. So you get different fruit profiles that work together, that meld well together. And then Pinot Meunier tends to be even more fruity. So with more red fruits, softer. It can add some, people call it rustic, but I prefer spice to the blend. So all those things just make it interesting, and it's interesting to play with them. And they're different in flavor profiles and texture profiles in ways that can matter in the glass.
And in the book, you do talk about, I have never had a 100% Pinot Meunier champagne, sparkle, anything. And in the book, you brought it up. Was that is that difficult to find?
So it is less difficult today than it was,
Okay.
say, 10 years ago. It's Pinot Meunier is very interesting. By the way, there's a big debate about what the grape is properly called. I didn't mention this in the book because I don't want to get into it, but some people prefer to call it Meunier, some people call it Pinot Meunier, and there's this weird argument about who's right and who's wrong. I don't really take sides there. I think that
But it's been determined.
locally,
It's been
yeah,
determined to be a mutation.
right. So
So
it's
what's so
right.
wrong
So
with calling it?
I don't know why. It's one of these things where I think it's been local custom and or it's argued to be local custom in Champagne to call it Meunier. Yet if you look at older books on Champagne, they call it Pinot Meunier. So I don't. Again, it's you could write a whole article on it, and frankly, I don't think it matters. But I just thought I would mention that. But so what's great is that there are more and more Pinot Meunier, 100% Pinot Meunier. In fact, I'm going to have one tonight, and
Oh,
so Apollonus, which is made by it was previously called Loriot, and now it's Apollonus. It makes 100% Pinot Meunier called Authentic Meunier, and it's not very expensive, and it's really good. And there are some also now very expensive 100% Pinot
oh,
Meunier champagnes as well. But what I think is great about that trend is that Pinot Meunier was just considered for a long time just the ugly child in the family, the one that you kind of hit off in the corner and brought out when you needed the kid, and when you didn't, put him away. But and it was almost as if people were embarrassed that Pinot Meunier was around. But there's nothing wrong with Pinot Meunier. I think it makes fascinating champagnes on its own. I mentioned some of them in the book that have become quite popular, many of them. And so I'm all for trying it. Again, my thing is, you know, I want to try it all. I want to see what's out there. I mean, that's part of the joy, I think, of drinking wine is the exploration. We can all find really good wines and great wines, and you can find your favorite 3 or 4 wines and then drink them all the time until you're dead. Or you can explore.
explore.
And I love the exploration part, and that's what I'm trying to encourage with my book too, is the exploration. So yes, to answer your question directly, it is getting easier to find 100% Pinot Meunier.
And in the book, I so I as I was reading, I'm trying to think, how did you create the outline for this book? Did you say, okay, I have these, and I don't know, I didn't count, but somewhere early in the book you said 22 champagnes. But I think you talk about more than 22 in the book, but I stopped counting, you know.
Yeah, there's more than that.
Okay.
There's 22 in chapter 2
Oh,
is where you
okay.
probably
Okay.
saw that. Yeah.
Okay. So when you were creating the outline for this book, did you say, okay, I have these champagnes, and when I drink these champagnes, this is what comes to mind. Okay, now I'm going to negotiate these champagnes to go into the book. Or did you outline the book and then say, okay, I want to talk about a rosé champagne. I'm going to talk about this one and then pull that down. How did this book come together?
Yeah, it was more the second way,
Okay.
because what I wanted to do was really provide a guide that you could walk through this book from the beginning to end. And if you took that walk with me or took a similar walk, I'm not suggesting you drink every single champagne in this book. And I think I ended up discussing somewhere around 40 or
Okay.
45 is the grand total. I think it's about 45. And I think I say in the book, if you drink a third of these, or if you
Right.
drink even not a third of these, but ones like them, you can get the point. And the idea is, so it was really constructed that you would take this journey, start in the beginning, go through it, and see what these champagnes do for you and how you can understand them better. So it's not like, hey, here are the top 45 champagnes that I like, and you should drink these and stock up, and that's that. It's really about, hey, let's figure out what kind of a champagne drinker you are. You know, what do you like? And of course, you can't really know what you like until you know what's out there
Right.
and what to do. But also organized it in a way that is really illustrative and comparative. So illustrative in the sense that I tried to find champagnes that illustrate a point, right? A point I'm trying to make about something. So if I'm talking about a wine that's oxidative or a wine that's reductive, which is the concept I get into, I want to give you some champagnes that are oxidative and some that are reductive, so that are good illustrations. That was mainly the thing. So instead of jamming into it just the champagnes I like or wanted to drink, that was really the point, was to do it in a way that was illustrative and then instructive.
And it's and actually the oxidative reductive thing I think was very beneficial to have samples of, because that's not something that anybody can go into a store and pick up a bottle and say, oh, this is an oxidative wine, right? They're not
Yeah,
going to know that. So that was very beneficial to have examples for. And what I was thinking is kind of beyond champagne, just for people who are trying to study. I like oxidative reductive is a confusing concept to people, because if it's oxidative, there's a reduction, and when it's a
right.
reduction, it's oxidate, there's oxygen. So it's like stupid science, like,
Yeah.
so to have those examples in there, I was thinking, wow, if somebody's really having trouble understanding this is proof in a bottle of what it does. So the examples play very powerful into that.
Yeah, I'm glad you think so. And that was really what I tried to accomplish. And to illustrate it a different way. So last night I was teaching a WSET level 1 course. And this just happened last night. A woman came up to me and she said, she knew about my book and she wanted to ask more questions about it. And then she said, I love champagne, so I want to learn more about it. And she said, and just out of the blue, she just said, my friends like Krug, and I know I should like it. I guess I should like it, but I really don't like it. And I said, see, that is great. See, so I happen to love Krug, okay? But my response was not to tell her, well, here are all the reasons why you should like Krug. My response was, okay, that's really good information. But what you don't know, what you don't understand is why you don't
Why
like
don't
Krug, right? And I think I know why she doesn't like it, because it's on the oxidative side. And that's most people who don't like it, but that's the point is, I mean, it's not, it's interesting to know that you like or don't like a particular wine, but what's really powerful is to know why you like it or why you don't like it, because that helps you figure out what else you might like out there,
right,
right? And that helps you on the path of thinking, okay, well, if I don't like this wine, I'll probably like this other kind of wine or something like that. And so I think that's the whole point is of something like oxidative reductive. It's not to be able to be a scientist and know what those terms really mean, be able to run around and spit facts about which champagnes are oxidative and which are not. The whole point is to understand your own palate. And so all are different. And I love your tagline. I'll never tell you what to drink, but I'll always share what's in my glass. And one reason I like that is that I think one of the concepts you're expressing is that second part of I'll always share what's in my glass is you're helping educate people about wine, not in the sense of saying, hey, here's this wine,
right,
I know more than you do. it's good, so go drink it. You're explaining concepts to help people figure out what's out there and then go see if they like something or not, right? And that's really what I'm trying to do as well.
Yeah, and that's, it's, you said it earlier, the only real way to find out what champagnes or any wine that you like is to pour yourself a glass and to try it. And
Right.
I got so upset on Instagram this morning, and I won't say names, I won't say whatever, but what it was a relatively person who has a rather large following and is supposed to be a wine educator, and and what the real was them, and I'm not even going to say what the variety is, them standing there and somebody pouring a bottle of a varietal specific wine, and the song was no 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 no, right? And
Mhm.
in the words it's saying, I just, there's not one out there that I like. There don't, if I see this
Right.
label, I don't want anything to do with it. And I think that that's, as an educator, that's horrible, because granted there may be a champagne that the Krug, I drink it and I don't like it. Does that mean I should never ever have any other champagne? No, because there's so many different things out there, and even Krug, heck, let her try a different bottle of it, a different, because they make
Yeah.
different ones, right? um but I was so upset over that, because you're teaching them, I taste it once and I don't like it, I'm done with this.
Right. And I say, and so that's, part of what my whole philosophy is, and what I try to impress upon people in the book is, yes, I know a lot about champagne. I've drunk a lot of champagnes, but what I'm really here to do is guide you into becoming the very best champagne drinker you can be for you. And if you end up now, that said, that doesn't mean that someone off the street doesn't know anything about champagne and drinks a glass of champagne and says this is terrible is going to be right, because honestly, you have to know something about what you're talking about to have an opinion that matters even to yourself, if that
Yeah,
makes sense. In other words, if there's something that I start to get into, but I don't know anything about it, I hope that I've been wise enough to reserve judgment about whether I like something or don't until I've really been through the field. And what's hard, and the main thing is doing it in an organized way. So even if you get 100 bottles of champagne, okay, you start drinking them and you say, I like this, I don't like this, I like this one, I don't like that one. What's difficult is if you don't understand, again, getting to the point of, if you don't understand why you don't like something or why you do or what's going on in the glass, it's very hard to then create your own little map of champagne for yourself. And that's what, again, that's what my book is really about, is guiding through this process for you. And at the end, you'll have your own map, so to speak,
great.
right? Of what your preferences are and what you'd like to explore and where you'd like to go next.
In the book, I see, I have never heard of this, so I was interested that you were talking about in the book. There's a special club, the Club Tresors. Now,
Mhm.
I've never seen, could be that I'm just oblivious, but I've never seen this designation on a bottle. So can you explain what that actually is, what it requires? You did so in the book, but to not give away
Sure.
all of the secrets
That's
of the
okay.
book.
I mean, just in general, the special club is essentially it's just an organization of producers who got together and decided we're going to have a club and call it the special club. I mean, that's essentially what it is. It's not like it has anything, any force of law, or that it. And in fact, I'll say that in general, I think it's a little bit dangerous to get too caught up in these things, because there's all sorts of label terms that are unregulated, or
Yes.
that are that mean one thing in one region and mean something else in a different region. I talk about this when it comes to Grand Cru and Premier Cru and how deceptive those terms really are in Champagne. But with something like Special Club, I think it's interesting. It's a small organization of producers who actually do have tight standards as to which wines can have the Special Club label, and I think It's not to say that every single special club champagne that I've ever had has been great. I've had some that I thought were disappointing, but there's a taste test. They test them. They decide whether the champagne every year makes the cut. They test them multiple times. Sometimes members of the club, their champagnes that they have submitted don't actually make the cut, which is really interesting. And so it shows they do have standards. So again, I don't want to give the impression that you should go to the store and if it says special club, that means this is a really great champagne. But what it does mean is that at least there's been some screening by some really knowledgeable folks in a club. Um, and I made the point in the book really about a particular champagne, which was the first 100% Pinot Meunier to make it, which I think is interesting. And it goes to your point is it difficult? And again, 25 years ago, I'm not sure that there were a lot that you could have found, especially, easily of 100% Pinot Meuniers. And now there's a trend of seeing more.
Well, when one makes it into the special club, everybody wants to be in the club now, right?
That's right. Right.
You have an entire section in the book dedicated to the rosé champagne, and you start talking about it. And the thing that intrigues me about rosé champagne is what is deemed kind of, and I don't want this to sound horrible, what is deemed a lower level process in the United States and in other areas is how the tradition is in champagne. So in the United States, I talk about it all the time. The two main methods of rosé is saignée and direct press, where saignée is bleeding and direct press is picked purposely. And it's really the low level wines that are, I'm going to take this red wine, I'm going to take this white wine and mix it together. Yet in champagne, that is a common, and actually, I don't know, one of the most common ways of making rosé. Can you talk about rosé champagne and,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think rosé champagne is fascinating for a number of reasons. The first one, the one that you mentioned, just the production method. So that method, the assemblage method of actually taking red wine and pouring it into white wine to change the color of the wine to rosé is barred in France for still wines. I'm not aware of a French still wine region, a region that allows French still rosé to be made that way. But it is allowed in champagne, and so that itself is interesting in how it's made. And then it's also made from the saignée method that you described. But what's really interesting about rosé champagne is that it is really expensive a lot of times. When you think about rosé, a lot of people just think of it as a kind of fun, fruity, not that serious wine, right? Now, I actually think there are some pretty amazing rosés out there, still rosés. I could think of a number that are not cheap and are really good, but for the most part, this whole rosé all day thing and the whole, pink wine thing.
Well, marketing.
Yeah, it's marketing and it's not very expensive in still wine. And Prosecco is now being made into rosé, and those aren't expensive either. But so for example, expensive champagnes that people have heard of, Dom Perignon, Krug, Cristal. The white champagne costs about half as much as the rosé versions of those champagnes. So you're taking a champagne that's already expensive, let's say a $200 Cristal, and turning it into a $400 Cristal rosé. So something else is going on in champagne, and it's I think so different from what we're used to when we talk about still rosés. These are in many ways just absolutely profound wines. I discuss a few of them in the book, but I can just tell you that some of my greatest moments and what really matters are the moments, right? It's interesting to talk about the technical aspects of the wine and how they're made, but I'm very, very adamant about the idea that what matters is the drinking experience. And because Obviously, there would be no wine without winemakers, and they are very important. But there would also be no wine without wine drinkers. And the experience of drinking wine and the joy that we get out of it, to me, from a consumer perspective, is the most important thing. And so, and I say that because rosé champagne is, I think, just a delight. I mean, there are so many great rosé champagnes, and yes, some of them are really expensive, but some of them are not. And even, in the 50, 40, 50, $60 range, there are rosé champagnes that are just absolutely beautiful. And I think it's unfortunate that some people just don't appreciate that because their image of rosé is more about the supermarket and the line of pink wines on the shelf that aren't that interesting. But I promise you, anybody, that if you really start to explore rosé champagne and you put aside any preconceptions you have about rosé and you just look at it as a wine and you open your mind, um, you will find great wines.
And that leads to one of the biggest questions that I always get asked, and kind of like ooh, you can find this thing, is grower champagne. You go pretty far in depth with the grower champagne. So first, why don't you just explain what grower champagne is, and then talk about some of the good, the bad, and the rumors of growers.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. I'm glad you asked. I get asked this all the time. By the way, the question that I'm asked most frequently is, "Hey, who are your favorite grower champagnes?" Or, can you give me a recommendation for 4 grower champagnes? And I've thought a lot about why that question is asked more than any other. And I'll get to that. But so just to give you the definition, so most champagne, the vast majority, and in the United States, something like 90% of the champagne we get or more is from the big champagne houses. The ones you've heard of, Moet and Chandon, Lanson, um, Roederer, Runar, and on and on. The big ones, they make a lot of champagne. They completely dominate the market. And that's because traditionally there was this setup and still exists today. It's still actually what happens is that most of the grapes in Champagne are not farmed by the large houses. They're farmed by growers who don't make champagne. So there's this traditional division in Champagne that we don't see as much in other areas, right? In a lot of areas, what we're used to is you see a producer, the producer grows the grapes, brings the grapes in, makes wine, right? In Champagne, it's never worked that way for the most part. It's with exceptions. For the most part, you have a lot of growers and then a few champagne houses, and the champagne houses buy grapes from the growers. Now, there are exceptions because now a lot of champagne houses own their own vineyards and source their own grapes, but even they usually are still sourcing at least some of their grapes from growers. And now, to get to the phenomenon, there are growers who make their own champagne. It's not that that's never existed. It's just that it's something that became incredibly popular and fashionable, in the last 20 years, let's say. And specifically, it happened because there were some American importers and distributors who figured out that this was a great way to sell really good champagne in the United States and elsewhere, and they did. And so now you have this phenomenon, and there are entire books written about this phenomenon of growers who are now, to some extent, the rock stars of champagne, right? Because at the big houses, unless you're super into it, like me, I mean, you might not know who the winemaker is, at Roederer, and you may not know some of the people, but what this does with grower champagne, it puts a human face on the wine. And as I'm sure you know, and you interview winemakers, right? This matters. People like knowing who the winemaker is, and they like the story of the family. The family-owned vineyards, the family-owned winemakers, and I do too, by the way. I mean, just to be very clear, I mean, who doesn't want to support small businesses? Who doesn't want to support farmers, and who doesn't want to support small winemakers? I mean, I, I don't know anybody who doesn't. the issue that we get into, I know you know where I'm going with this, and I talk about this in the book, is there's this weird, fetishizing of growers and grower champagne that I think has gotten way out of proportion to reality. And the reason I have a problem with it is not because I'm trying to make some kind of political statement, but I think, again, from the perspective of the consumer, which is that's all I care about. I don't make wine. I don't sell wine. I'm a consumer. My friends are consumers, and I wrote this book for wine consumers. From the perspective of the consumer, what the consumer is interested in is the champagne. Is it good? Is it not good? Or what's it about? And I'm not going to deny, and I say this in the book, I'm not going to deny that every time you drink a wine, not every time, but often when you drink wine, there's a story attached to it that's in your brain, right? So if you drink Cristal, you're thinking about whatever you think about Cristal. If you're drinking from wine that your best friend made, you're thinking about how much you love your best friend, right? So I'm not denying that that's part of it. But when we look at what's in the glass, the point I think that is important is that grower champagne is not, as a category, better than house champagne, period. Okay. There are great grower champagnes. There are great champagnes made by the big houses. There are mediocre champagnes by the big houses. There are mediocre champagnes made by growers. And the fact that somebody owns a really small parcel of land and makes wines themselves, and they're a really cool person, does not mean, by definition, that they make great champagne. It's just not logical to think that. And so, again, people can think what they want to think about any grower and fall in love with whoever they want to fall in love with, and I have no issue with that. I just, so to get back to the question that you get asked and I get asked about, hey, who are your favorite growers? There's this implication that, well, just forget about the house champagnes, right? Let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the growers. They're more interesting or whatever. And so I resist that somewhat. Now, that said, I drank a lot of grower champagne. I think, in fact, if you look at in the book, the champagnes I talk about are way disproportionately favoring toward the growers as opposed to the houses. So why would that be, given the rant I just went on? There is something really great about grower champagne that in the reason why there is more grower champagne in my book proportionally, out of proportion than there is house champagne. The reason is grower champagnes can experiment and do experiment in ways that the big houses can't and don't, right? So talk about the fact that there are this Pinot Meunier phenomenon, right? This is largely, almost exclusively, a phenomenon. I'm talking about 100% Pinot Meunier, right? Of growers or smaller houses, because it's not that popular. It's not going to sell. You're not going to sell, a million bottles of 100% Pinot Meunier champagne, and so it's just not worth the time or effort of the big houses they can dial in their consumers' preferences, and they can dial it in pretty well. And so if you want to find weird stuff, interesting stuff, things that are different, you're going to be drinking a lot of grower champagne. So that's what I think is great about the growers. And the final point I make about this is that, let's talk about what's great about the houses, which is that they can reliably, at a good price point, deliver great champagne to you, right? So, I mean, not everybody has the time or ability to go scouring the internet to find one bottle of some grower champagne somewhere. If you go to a liquor store right now, they've probably got house champagnes, right, from big brands that are really good, and they're consistently good, and there is something, I think, to that.
And my last question, because I try to keep these to an hour,
Yeah.
is, and this is another question I get, and honestly, it's an excellent question. So we're very used to seeing vintages in still wines, and when you go into a store, you can be, if you're really into wine, you know what the current vintage is, or you know what vintage you're going to be looking for. If, oh, look at this vintage, oh my God, it's still here, I'm going to take it. But that's not so true when it comes to champagne. We have a lot of no vintage, which an envy. And you do talk about multi-vintage, which I loved that you talked about that. But when somebody's going into the store, right, you can kind of go in and say, oh, you know what, the current vintage of this, I don't know, Sangiovese is a 2018, and here's a 2015 on the shelf. They're not selling these wines, right? These aren't fresh wines. Not saying it's not good, but it's not fresh wines. When you go into a store looking for champagne and you have no vintage or these multi-vintage wines, how does somebody know whether that wine is actually being sold by that store, so it's being turned over, or is that an older bottle and maybe you want to pass on that?
Well, that is a little bit difficult to tell in a lot of situations because unfortunately, labeling in champagne is incredibly erratic. And back labels sometimes will tell you what the base year is, and that's one way you would know.
Okay.
So of a non-vintage champagne, what you like to look for is to see if it says that the base year, let's say, is 2012, and that would tell you that's the base year, and there are reserve wines from earlier on in there. I wouldn't worry too much about the turnover, frankly, issue, because champagne it does turn over at retail pretty quickly, and also it's not going to die anytime soon. I've never had a situation where I bought a non-vintage champagne, took it home, and thought, oh no, I got some kind of an older bottle and it's not good anymore in some way. So I wouldn't worry about that. But what I think is concerning is the fact that people don't understand that a non-vintage wine is not necessarily inferior to a non-vintage
Right.
champagne is not necessarily inferior to a vintage champagne. You really just have to understand that these are two different styles of champagne, and which I go through in the book, and that's more important really than trying to figure out whether you should buy a vintage. I know vintage champagne, it just looks cooler. Like you take it to somebody's house and you go, hey, there's a 2008,
Right.
but there's great non-vintage champagne, and champagne built its reputation on non-vintage champagne and blending vintages. And in fact, I mentioned, Charles Heidsieck's non-vintage champagne. It is absolutely amazing. It's $40 to $50 depending on where you get it. And part of the style is these older reserve wines, which make it just an unbelievable wine. You take it home, put it nice in water, drink it, and it's amazing today. And you don't have to age it, and you don't have to worry about what the vintage is. So it's a little more complicated, unfortunately, with champagne than it is, like you said, with looking at a Sangiovese from a certain region and looking at the vintage year.
So the name of the book again is Press for Champagne. Right, so Christopher, can you tell people where they can find the book, what the best way to order it is, and where they can find you?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So the best way, the easiest way, I think, is on Amazon.com. You search for Press for Champagne book. You will find it. It's also available, elsewhere. And if for people who don't shop on Amazon, I think you can get it through Barnes and Noble or other retailers because it is in other distribution methods. It's just that, for me, I order a lot of stuff. I don't work for Amazon, but I order a lot of stuff from Amazon because I find it quite easy. And
Yep.
so you can easily get it there. And also, what's good about Amazon is you can see the ratings, what people have said about the book and that sort of thing rather easily. In terms of where to find me, I am not super all over social media. The main place I am is on Twitter, where like you and I are connected. C_S_Ruhland, RUHLAND, where I think if you just put in Christopher Ruhland, there aren't a lot of us out there. Christopher Ruhland and wine, you'll see. I tweet about wine and spirits, not just champagne, but I've loved wine and spirits for a long time. And I really what I tweet about mostly are the experiences that I've had and the kinds that I think, the emotional, visceral experiences and things that other people might have as well.
And I'm going to be remiss if I let you go without one last question, because I think champagne is spectacular. What is your favorite food pairing with champagne?
That's a good question because it's a tough one for me to answer. I will answer, but it's tough one because I drink champagne with all kinds of foods, which I just think it matches with. You wouldn't believe the range of foods. I'll have champagne with a steak, no problem. I think it goes
Okay.
great with a steak. So, but all that said, what we do, we like to make popcorn and watch a football game or something.
Yeah,
And
popcorn.
my wife, she really puts a lot of salt on the popcorn. I put a lot of.
Oh,
I'm a butter person, so I put a lot of butter, and she puts a lot of salt. So we get super salty popcorn. And the thing about champagne is, it really goes great with salty foods. And so, salted butter popcorn in champagne is something I do a lot.
it amazes me how well, whenever somebody says, what do I pair with this? And lots of times I don't know what the food is. Like, I'm like, I don't know. That's some weird food that I don't eat. Champagne. Go with champagne.
Absolutely.
Because
It
it
pairs with
really,
everything, yeah, except, arguably not with super sweet food, which
um,
is strange because we drink it with wedding cake, and I'm not sure that champagne and wedding cake
I
is a
think that's
very
more
good
just
pairing.
tradition than,
But
yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I actually think it's one of the world's most versatile food wines. Um, I, I'm gonna have it tonight with pizza, pepperoni pizza, by the way.
Okay.
And but we drink it all the time. Now, again, there are so many different styles, so I won't necessarily have the same type of
Right.
champagne with the same boots. So, typically, maybe I'll have a Blanc de Blanc champagne with the salted popcorn. But if I'm having steak, I'll have a Blanc de Noirs, right? So 100% Pinot Noir or 100% Pinot Meunier, or maybe I'll have a rosé champagne. So there are all sorts of, you can get into details with the pairings, but I just think there's a champagne for just about every food.
I have to agree with that. And I think that that is a perfect way to end this, because champagne is so versatile. And like you said, there's so many different styles of it. And that's what I think I got the most out of your book, is that the exploration into champagne, A, should be fun, and B, that there is a champagne or multiple champagnes for every palate out there. So enjoy the exploration and find some bottles that you enjoy, and always find another bottle to try.
Thank you very much, Lori. I really appreciate it. I've had a lot of fun.
Well, I am glad, and thank you very much for the book and for reaching out to me. I enjoyed it a lot. And if I love the fact that you have the different champagnes in here. And I really did love that it wasn't always just the ones that everybody hears, because, that's, we don't need everybody, everybody's drinking those big, not that big houses are bad, but everybody knows the big houses. And when people read this book, their eyes are going to be opened up to a wider array of what champagne has to offer. And it does have a lot to offer.
I'm glad you think so, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's a little early, so I actually only have water. Normally, I would say slancha with a glass, but my husband would be upset if I opened champagne before he got home, because there wouldn't be any left by the time he got home. So I will just say thank you very much, and I will talk to everybody soon.